Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar with Harvey Bakari. I'm so excited to have him come back and present at NCU. Each time he comes, he brings an amazing presentation and certainly helps revisit some of our past and makes us think about some things for the future. So just a couple of housekeeping items for you. I do have the chat open, so feel free to post anything in the chat that you like. As always, we are recording this webinar and I will post it in the CTL LibGuides webinar page for future reference. Please ask any questions that you might have in the Q&A. I know that Harvey will take breaks when he feels like it's appropriate and answer those questions for you and have some conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Harvey Bakari.
Well, thank you. And once again, this is the last in a series that I put together for NCU, King's Dream, Jefferson's Prediction, Connecting Our American Dream. And so it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to sharing this presentation with you. So I'm going to start off with the theme, if some of you are not familiar with it, why King's Dream and Jefferson's Prediction. I juxtapose these two men because more than likely, most Americans, probably even children, probably know Thomas Jefferson for those famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." I think we learned that pretty early in grade school, if not at home and in other places. Well, by 1963, in the generation of Martin Luther King, he wanted to make that dream or that self-evident truth a reality in the United States. But unfortunately, at that time, it was a separate but equal United States. So it's difficult to feel that those words are true, that those words for many African Americans rang hollow. It was not a reality in their lives. As a matter of fact, it was a contradiction. So Jefferson provides a clue as to, perhaps a clue as to why it was such a difficult conflict or paradox for America. Jefferson made what I argue is a prediction back in 1790. He said the two races, speaking of blacks and whites, equally free, cannot live in the same government. But let's take a look at the context in which he said it. You can see here that he's talking about the fact that inevitably these people, free blacks and slaves, but particularly slaves, will one day be free, but that the two races equally free cannot live in the same government. Later on, that was something that you could argue that Abraham Lincoln also believed. Many people believed at that time period. If you look at history within its time frame, it was difficult to believe that that was possible, at least in their generation. Many of them thought perhaps a future generation. Now, why am I talking about Jefferson and Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, I have my background experience is in the museum world. Now, I do have a degree in the fine arts and a minor in African American studies from Virginia Commonwealth University. But my public experience came from working, public historian experience came from working at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I spent 23 years there. Now, this history that we presented, even though we're doing real reenactments and so forth, it's based on scholarship from across the country, as well as we had a staff, various staffs of different disciplines that provided scholarship as well. It's one of the largest living history museums in the nation in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it came to symbolize a place that would represent the founding fathers, the fife and drums, the guns, which you saw before. But it was my job and that of the other people I work with to present the African-American story. But they made up 50% of the population of Williamsburg, and they were a part and would become a part of the revolutionary generation, the American Revolution generation. So that was part of my responsibilities. It was a place that is about a mile long. It has like 88 original buildings, many restored buildings, reproductions, antiques, thousands in their collections. There's museums. It's actually a resort in addition to being a living history museum. So But one thing I will say about my public speaking experience, as you see the trades that practice in the 18th century, is that I was not, as a public historian, you're not speaking to the choir. You're speaking to people from all levels of life. They could be a college professor, they could be a fireman, they could be a housewife or a house husband, they could be a child, it could be a custodian. So I'm not one that just speaks to a choir. I have to, as a public historian, you have to speak to all. So I'm going to do the summary of the previous webinars in this series. We're going to look at the Dred Scott decision and African-American citizenship, which was denied. We're going to look at the Civil War, a nation divided. And I'm connecting, so I'm not going to be able to do anything comprehensive. I'm just connecting the American Revolutionary generation to the Civil Rights generation. We're going to look at radical Reconstruction and Black citizenship, the American dream deferred, separate but equal, and then Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream. So the first seminar I did for NCU was views on anti-Blackness from the 1500s to 1600s. We started off looking at the Spanish Empire, and that it would be the Spanish and the Portuguese who would initiate the slave trade. They would also begin to circulate information about the Africans being inferior, uncivilized, unchristian, and so seeking gold and wealth, but also extracting labor from Africans would become part of the mission of the Crown of Spain, Portugal, and the Catholic Church, because at that time there was no separation of church and state. So you can see just by some of these quotes what they thought of the Africans that they captured. Next, as we come to our story, the British. Once the British got involved, much later, beginning with Queen Elizabeth I from 1562 all the way to King George III, by the time they got involved in the slave trade, the British were more proficient and began to dominate the slave trade. As a matter of fact, the British would become the country that would transport almost more slaves than any other country. But one thing I will note is that Spain and Portugal were the first to start the slave trade, and Spain and Portugal were the last to end slave trade and slavery in the Americas. British were the first to end, to move for abolishing the slave trade of all the Europeans. Now, ironically, some Africans may have had these letters branded on their chests, R-A-C-E. It did not mean race, it meant the Royal African Company of England. Now, next, as the Africans were brought here into Virginia, they were part of an interracial labor force of Native Americans, white indentured servants. And there they would live together, eat together, have families together. So there was quite a bit of interracial mixing amongst that interracial servants and slaves in Virginia. But then the gentlemen had to determine race and status because they wanted to determine who would have rights and who would not have rights within the colony of Virginia. I'm just using Virginia as an example. The colonies in the north and the colonies further south in the Carolinas, they operated differently, but around the same principle. But I'm using Virginia because it had the largest population of enslaved Africans of all the 13 colonies. So Virginia created hereditary chattel slavery. How did they do this? They decided that the condition of the mother would be the condition of the child. That made slavery hereditary by birth. That's one of the distinguishing features between ancient slavery that's been around since the beginning of mankind and this particular type of an American slavery based on heredity and based on race. Oh, one last thing is, for the better government of Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, bond are free. So very early in the colonial time period, they were creating a separate laws or separate laws for Negroes, mulattoes, or biracial people, and Indians. So from the very beginning, the laws are not equal, as Jefferson would predict later on in 1791. So the second webinar was the White Veil from 1600 to 1800. This particular presentation, what I did, I had a survey with the participants, and the task was to identify these people. Their faces would flash for about 3 seconds. You had to identify if they were Black or if they were white. And because that was important, because identifying who was Black and white in the 18th century, as we will see, is going to be very important. It's the difference between having privileges and not having privileges, status and non-status, if you will. So some of the people here, as you can see, were actually passing as white and were able to take that secret to them to the grave. And so we covered that in that presentation. But what that did, the whole question of being able to identify and distinguish biracial people from whites was becoming a problem very early on in the colonies. So by 1705, at least in Virginia, they had to actually use ancestry to determine who was white and who was non-white, or in this case, mulatto. And so it's the great-grandchild. And also in that presentation, we covered a court case by the young attorney, Thomas Jefferson, a court case that was held in the Virginia General Court in the capital of Virginia. And he was he did represent a mulatto servant who had run away. His name was Samuel Howell, who claimed that he was a free man. The laws were created such that in Virginia and in other colonies, they punish the biracial child for the sexual transgressions of their interracial parents, in particular, Black men and white women. And yes, it did occur in the colonial time more than people really think. Most people start history in the 19th century, and there's a different image of white women in the 19th century. 1600s, 1700s, it was much, in early 1800s, was much different. But these children had to pay the price. They had to be punished. They had to serve for 31 years. But we discussed that in that particular program as well. Then the next program was our Paradoxical Inheritance, which focused on the American dream and the American Revolution, because without the American Revolution, there is no dream to be had for enslaved people. Now, what I did introduce people into in that presentation, and a few others, was the importance of genealogy when it comes to African Americans' approach to history. For some African Americans, for some white Americans and others, history is not just facts and dates. It has to do also with people and their lives, their lived lives that they and their ancestors, not only did they live, but that the person today inherit from their ancestors, where you live, how much wealth you may or may not have, what educational opportunities you may or may not have. Sometimes there are generational impacts on people. So what we did, we looked at this, and you can look on this chart. You can see 2 is for your parents, 4 is for your grandparents, 8 is for your 8 grandparents, you go on. So there's 128 people that make you possible. So going back that amount of generations. You go back further, of course, just do the math, it'll be in the thousands. And then I talked about something that was also important for African Americans, in particular, when searching for their ancestry, because one feature of slavery and slave trade is the feature of separation and fragmentation. From the transatlantic slave trade to slavery and being sold in the Americas, there was a continual process of separation and fragmentation. So for many African Americans who are concerned not just about the history, but how they relate to it, the 1870 United States Census was very important, because for the 4 million enslaved people in the United States, this was the first time since 1790 that they were recorded in the United States Census as husbands, wives, children. Before, they would have been counted as slaves' property on property inventories. So this is very important, and it's the starting point, like a ground zero for many African Americans doing their genealogy and trying to connect history as opposed to being disconnected from history. Now, because of the separation, I took this chart from 23andMe. Full disclosure, I don't work for 23andMe. But I took this chart and I used it to help look at how my ancestry intersected with American history. And the first thing you see on the chart, the timeline from 1690 to 1930. And then over top of that, you see a number, 1, 2, all the way to +8. That represents a generation. It's about 30 years time period between each generation. They're averaging. Now, obviously, in real life, it could vary, but in the 18th century, everybody that's listening to me, if you were 40, you were pushing it. That was about the average lifespan in the 1700s, 1800s. Next, you see the DNA. Now, I'm using this just as a tool. It suggests where perhaps my ancestors entered into my DNA, because each ancestor leaves a long strand of DNA within your 23 pairs of DNA. And the longer those strands are and the more populated those strands are, it indicates or suggests that that person was most recent in your line of descent. So by looking at this, I can also take that chart and transform it into looking at the transatlantic slave trade. And I can see that it suggests that my African ancestry came from many of the major ports. Every place you see those green circles, that's a major port of exportation of Africans to the Americas. So I can look at that and I can say, okay, I may have ancestors from this region, probably not from the coast, probably from the interior. And I'll just say this as a note for anyone who's interested in DNA. They're doing more to try to include more African-American research as well as more African research. So hopefully in the future, there would be more concise information or better information than we have now. So it's just at this point quite suggestive. Then we focused on the Blacks in their own words of the American Revolution. 1770, the Boston Massacre, the enslaved people there, you can see Crispus Attucks. He's, in this rendition, he's being shot by the British, and he's there and he's in the center of the painting. So the Black population know that something is going on. They don't know how it's going to turn out. But until that point, the Blacks, the great number of Blacks in Boston, they're writing petitions to the governor. And this is just one example of what they said. And it shows you how bleak it was before there was an American dream. It was just going to be generation after generation of slavery. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no way out. You could run, you could escape somewhere, but that's an individual form of self-emancipation. But in terms of freedom and general emancipation, there was nothing on the horizon. So here's one expression. They said, we have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country. So a people without a country. And then we talked about how the American Revolution was going to change that. 6 months after the Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, once again, the people of Boston said that they have in common with all other men a natural right, an unalienable right to that freedom. So even at that time period, even before Martin Luther King mentions it in his 1963 speech, the Black American Revolution generation is taking the rhetoric of that time period and they're owning it for themselves, and they're using it to try to persuade the founding fathers and others to see the contradictions of them fighting for freedom and against tyranny from Great Britain, but also holding their Black brethren enslaved in the Americas. But by the end of the revolution, before the revolution ended, Thomas Jefferson said something else. Now, he's not the only one. As I said earlier, these ideas of race and superiority began in Europe during the transatlantic slave trade. But when Thomas Jefferson writes and Thomas Jefferson speaks, I argue everybody listens. But he says that the Blacks are inferior to whites in the endowment of both body and mind. It's not just that it's something that was said by anyone. It was said by a founding father, someone who was revered as Thomas Jefferson, that got the attention of many people. And that leads us to the race problem. After the revolution, after the victory at Yorktown, founding fathers have to figure out many things. What type of government we're going to have, a federalist government, a constitutional government. Is there going to be a separation of church and state? There's questions about commerce. What is the role of the federal government? What is the role of state government? All of these issues. And among them, of course, is slavery, but the race problem. What are they going to do with free Blacks and emancipated slaves? Where do they belong in America. Is this American dream part of their dream? Because for most whites, they considered the white man's country, white man's war. But almost 5,000, over 5,000 blacks had fought side by side with white soldiers for American independence. So they began to own it. They were optimistic that perhaps they could become part of that American revolutionary generation. The founding fathers would see the light and have the will to end slavery. Well, of course, we know that's not what happened, but everybody can hope and dream. So that brings us to connecting our American dream. Now, again, this is not comprehensive. I'm just connecting the American Revolutionary generation to the Civil War generation of Martin Luther King. It's that American dream that all men are created equal. But race would become a major factor in preventing that dream from becoming possible. So that brings us to where I stopped at the last presentation, which is Dred Scott case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court, and it's worth repeating, the Supreme Court said that the question is simply this, because Dred Scott was suing for his freedom. It's a long story. I don't really want to spend too much time with the background, but he's suing for his freedom. It's taken almost 14 years and so forth. But here's the question before Justice Taney. The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors are imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of a political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by the instrument to the citizen? And then they answered the question. We think not. We think they are not, and that they are not included, and we're not intended to be, and we're not intended to be included under the words citizens, the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges. They were at the time considered a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and were, and whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to the authority and had no rights or privileges. So he's pretty emphatic about that. But Frederick Douglass had something else to say. He said, you know, Justice Taney left something out. He left out that as a part of the American Revolutionary generation, the people who actually were there, who fought side by side, because by the time of Dred Scott's decision, many of the people of the American Revolutionary generation were either dead or pretty old at that point. So Frederick Douglass reminds Justice Taney that the churches, the Presbyterian, Baptist, as well as Methodist churches and their denomination of Friends or Quakers, they were beginning to oppose slavery. He went on to talk about the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Jay, and Franklin, and Ruth, and Hamilton, and a host of others. They did not include the word slavery in the Constitution for a reason. That's the point he's making. There's some suggestion to it, but there's no use of the word slave or slavery in the Constitution. And he also quotes General George Washington, when he also talked about slavery can only be undone by legislation. And then he talked about some of the rising abolitionist movements in the slave states after the American Revolution: Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and in Georgia. And he said that they were also a part of trying to move towards an interracial America, an America where Blacks would be free and not be slaves. But it would not happen, because one of the opposing forces of that time period would be the pro-slavery movement. But ironically, there was one thing that Frederick Douglass forgot to include in his rebuttal to the Dred Scott case, and that was the service of over 5,000 Black men in the Continental Army and Navy that made the American Revolutionary victory possible, as they participated in the revolution side by side with white soldiers in an integrated army fighting for American freedom and independence. So you could sense that they probably really thought that revolution included them, even though they knew the whites didn't, many didn't. They saw it as a part of their heritage, their inheritance. Now, the only other thing some Blacks could do out of frustration are, actually, I shouldn't say frustration, because many of these conspiracies and rebellions were well planned. It's just that they were revealed before they could take place. But just, I'm not going to go through this list, but I just wanted to make sure you know this. And also just to make one big point, after the American Revolution, the conspiracies and rebellions became large scale. Before that, they were in various regions of the country, but these sometimes covered several states in their planning. They were not able to execute, but even in their planning, it was very large scale. Now, I'm going to see if there's, before I get to the Civil War, I wanted to see if any questions, Emily, any questions yet from?
At this time, there's nothing in the chat or the Q&A.
All right. All right. Don't forget, you can ask those questions. I can answer them. I'll take a break, but let me just march on. Looking at the Civil War. Now, again, the Civil War, the country was divided. Slave states, free states. There was constant concern about the expansion of slavery and the new territories. A number of events that I don't have time to cover, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and so on and so forth. But there are many, when talking about the Civil War, or as some people would say, the War of Northern Aggression, when talking about the Civil War, there are many different perspectives you can start from, whether it's the political history, it could be the military history and the battles. But I'm going to focus on emancipation and Reconstruction because my goal is to try to connect the idea of the American dream that all men are created equal with the civil rights generation of Martin Luther King. So that's the direction I'm going to take for this presentation. So looking at the Reconstruction, this was an important time. Remember, for the enslaved community, as the war started, historians go back and forth. Was it about slavery? Was it not about slavery? There are some historians who kind of meet in the middle who say, well, if it wasn't about slavery in the beginning, the Emancipation Proclamation did make the war about slavery in 1863. But you can see 1865, after the war, there's a time of Reconstruction. The country is trying to pull itself together. And they're trying to make America live up to the reality of all men are created equal. This is the dream of the grandparents, or well, parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents of the Blacks who lived in the generation of the Civil War. This is what they were looking for after the American Revolutionary War, but it came after the Civil War. Because war is always a time for change. It's a time of disruption and chaos, and it's always been a time of change for free Blacks, and particularly for enslaved people. Now, 1866, the Civil Rights Act, don't have enough time to go into it, but it's one of the most important acts. It's the first act to actually, even though Jefferson talked about all men are created equal, this was the first legislation to say or that this was a right of American people to have civil rights. But that had to be backed up by a constitution which guaranteed citizenship. And I'm going to show you what it meant to the enslaved people. Then 15th Amendment, 1870, same time as the 1870 Census, and then the 1873 Civil Rights Act. But what did it really mean for the enslaved people? Because that's what I'm going to focus on. The 13th Amendment, yes, it meant that you wouldn't be a slave anymore. You could be with your family. You can try to get your marriage sanctioned. But also it meant certain things that were going to stop. You know, they would sing songs like "No More Auction Block for Me," or the Great Negro Spiritual, as Martin Luther King said, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." What it stopped was the domestic slave trade. Over 1 million American-born Blacks was sold from the Upper South to the Lower South during the antebellum period. This is a map that gives you an idea of where some of them were taken. But some went by land, some traveled by land, some were traveled by steamships along the coast. My great-grandfather, he was sold from Virginia, which I've been able to verify. He was sold, he left, actually, he kept telling a story about being sold from Virginia to Louisiana. So he said he walked So he took one of those routes from Virginia, maybe Richmond, Petersburg, or Alexandria, all the way down to probably Natchez in Mississippi, and then perhaps in one of the markets and the hotels of New Orleans. But that's now gone. Another thing that the 13th Amendment ended, that was going to be the illegal smuggling of Africans into the Americas after Congress abolished the slave trade in 1808. Many investors, the South, for King Cotton, they needed more than the million or so blacks who were being sold in the domestic slave trade. People like some of the Brown brothers of Brown University were involved in trafficking, smuggling illegally Africans into the Americas. And here again is a chart that shows you some of the places that the Africans were smuggled into. And once again, using DNA as well as the census, it suggests that several, maybe 3 of my ancestors may have been smuggled into the country in that way. So that's gone. Now, the 14th Amendment was important because once again, that was the dream of the revolutionary generation. These soldiers who fought on the battlefield, some of them returned home infirmed. The Rhode Island Regiment, which we represented right here, some of the soldiers, they got frostbite during the winter encampment, lost their toes, lost other body parts. But also, some of them received their pensions, their state pensions, federal pensions, and others received land for their service to the country. So this was a vision they had when they went out on the battlefield. They knew they were taking a long shot. But if they weren't able to live out that American dream, they felt that this generation of the Civil War era would be able, with the 14th Amendment, were living out the dream that they had fought for from the American Revolution. Another thing that comes to an end with the 14th Amendment, blacks no longer, particularly free blacks, no longer had to make the decision of whether to stay in the United States and fight for American citizenship or to immigrate, as you can see here, I'm going the wrong direction, or to immigrate to Liberia. About 14,000 blacks immigrated to Liberia. The majority came from Virginia. So that was no more. You didn't have to leave. Now the Constitution says you're born in the United States, you're now an American citizen. And that was done because they knew that if the former Confederates ever got back in office, they would work towards denying citizenship for blacks. The 15th Amendment was the voting rights for black males. We'll get to black females and women shortly. But if you remember in the earlier presentation, we talked about 1705 in Virginia. They had to establish who shall not hold office in Virginia. And they said that no Negro, mulatto, or Indian shall hold any ecclesiastical, civil, military, or any place of public trust or power. So you can't change your condition. But with the 15th Amendment and the right to vote, and in several of the former slave states, blacks were the majority. Therefore, thousands of blacks would be elected to federal, state, and local office. So that, again, was something that had been wished for by the previous generation. But now I'm going to talk about the redemption movement, because from the very beginning, there were Reconstruction riots during Reconstruction, before all the Reconstruction amendments were passed. And Black communities were being attacked. For many of the Southern whites of the defeated Confederacy, they were obviously humiliated. And they also had a fear of Black empowerment and Black political power. They referred to as Black rule. The other thing that they were also concerned about, because Black men were now free and could vote, they were concerned about miscegenation, Black men and white women. These were very hot points, I should say political points at that time period. And one could argue that it tends to still be something that perpetuates in American society. Now, of course, just 1 year after the 13th Amendment, you have the formation of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. And they, as well as other groups, they weren't the only ones, but there were other groups. Their mission was going to be redemption. They were going to try to return back to power. They were going to try to take power back from the Republican Party, as they would call them, the carpetbaggers, the Northerners who came down, the scallywags, who were the Southerners who joined the Republican Party. Their goal was going to be step by step, through terror, through violence, through legislation, through any means necessary, to regain control, the Democratic Party to regain control of the Southern states. And they would have an ally, and that ally would be the Supreme Court. And one of the most important cases, there were several cases, the Supreme Court had pretty much nullified the effectiveness of the 13th, well, really the 14th and 15th Amendment. But it was the Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court decided that separate but equal was constitutional in the United States. This gave the states the power they needed to really kind of keep the federal government out of their business, as well as the federal government could, and some would argue, kind of just turn its back and let the Southern states do as they will in terms of race relations and enforcing separate but equal. Now, separate but equal, or Jim Crow, was not immediate. It did take about less than a decade, but the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, it opened the window to states to be able to legally claim that as long as that separate but equal was constitutional. So they manipulated that to their own self-interest throughout the South. Now, I'm going to now move ahead from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century and the Great War. Now, I know I'm making a jump here, but time is limited. I'm not, like I said, this is just meant to be connections. It's not comprehensive. But there was an important person named Lieutenant Charles Hamilton Houston. He was from Washington, D.C. His father was an attorney. He went to Dunbar High School. Dunbar High School was apparently one of the best high schools for Blacks in the United States at that time. So he was well positioned. Father's an attorney, has his own practice. He goes to Dunbar High School, he goes to college, and then the war breaks out. Well, Lieutenant, he decides to enlist because if he enlists, he can go in as an officer. Well, he goes to World War I. And of course, it's a separate but equal America, so he's mistreated. And he made a pledge that if he survives the war, when he comes back, he's going to break the back of segregation in the United States through legal channels. But that was just one goal that African Americans had. There were many ways to try to achieve civil rights. There were many different people, not just Charles Hamilton Houston, not just Booker T. Washington, not just W.E.B. Du Bois. There were many women whose names are not as famous, who were all part of various movements, and they all had different ideas. I put this together to show that African Americans have never been a monolithic people. They all had different ideas of how to address separate but equal and equality in the United States. So I'm just using Martin Luther King, but I could have used several other people. So some of the directions people thought, hey, we'll be able to achieve the American dream and make it a reality if we have education. Others would say, no, not education. Or yeah, we need some education, but economics. We need jobs. We need housing. We need to be able to work and raise our families. Others would say, no, politics. Whether it was with this political party or the Democrats or the Republicans and the various other political parties. Oh, no, we need to go after the executive branch. We need to talk with the legislative branch or the judicial branch. Others had different organizations, some of them who were capitalists, Marxists, communists. The communists were very much interested and did, in fact, influence some of those, infiltrate some of the organizations as African Americans were seeking answers. And then, of course, there's civil rights, civil disobedience. Again, some people who thought politics was the way would say, oh, no, let's not do the civil disobedience. Others thought civil rights, like Du Bois. And others were like, no, economics. So I just put all of this array of ideas up so that you could see it was not monolithic. There was no blueprint, but I'm going to follow the blueprint of a couple of people, one of them being Charles Hamilton Houston. Now, what did he do? When he came back, he was going to be an attorney like his father. He went to Harvard School of Law. Then he went to Howard University School of Law, where he became the dean of that department. And his goal was to train lawyers to be civil rights activists. They were going to go across the country. They had one mission, one primary mission, which was to crush Plessy versus Ferguson. Everything in daily life, from the minute being able activities, where you could eat, where you could sleep, could you go to the zoo, things you had to explain as Black parents to your children why you can't go to the zoo because Negroes are not allowed except on a particular day of the week. All of this was being shaped by the window that the Supreme Court left open, I would argue, with Plessy versus Ferguson. And so that was his main mission. Mission number one was Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, that being said, let's take a look at some of the key points. And again, this is at a glance. Let me stop and see if there's any questions before I go through this glance, because he's going to glance from the early 1900s up till the Brown versus the Board of Education. Emily, are there any questions or comments so far?
At this time, there's no questions from the group. At the end, if we have time, I do have a question, but I'll wait until the end. So.
Okay. All right. Well, look like I'm going to have some time at the end because I'm going to try to wrap this up. All right. So let's look at a couple of landmark events or markers just to connect the time period with Charles Hamilton Houston. And so let's begin with Birth of a Nation. Now, why would you include a movie in African-American history? For people who study film, this was a very important film. Yes, the content was about the Klan being the heroes, and it's a redemption story. The Klan are the good guys. Reconstruction was bad. Reconstruction, Negroes wanted access to white women, Black rule. So that was part of the story of Birth of a Nation. But what made it so important is its technical, the technical skills that were used in Birth of a Nation and the movie industry at that time. But also, Birth of a Nation did in fact increase or I should say, cause a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s after Birth of a Nation, because it went through movie theaters. The president said it was history written in lightning. And so this was most people took it as the gospel. And so it's very, very influential. So it does, in my opinion, deserve a place in history when you're talking about African-American history, because this is really going to drive forth this recruitment of the Klan. They marched in Washington, D.C. You could find them in great numbers. Their membership increased, even in the North. Just a little side note that I heard from one lecture, the Klan were not just after African-Americans, obviously, in the South, redemption, but also you could find one of the largest numbers of Klan people, of Klan membership were in places like New Jersey, because they were also concerned about the various European immigrants coming into the country. Those European immigrants had to be anglicized. They're coming in as Jews, they're coming in as Catholic, they're coming in as Irish, they're coming in from Italy, they're coming in not speaking English. And part of what they did, besides what they did with African Americans in the South, also impacted immigrants coming to various parts of the country. That's a side note. But also the World War I, when, as I mentioned earlier with Charles Hamilton Houston, when the Black soldiers came back, it was a turning point, because that was the first time that a large number of Black soldiers left the United States and came back. They went to Europe. They had a different experience with the French, and some didn't come back, some stayed. And so when they came back with a new vigor of manhood and confidence. But also when they came back, many of the whites knew that, hey, these guys went overseas, they're coming back, they've learned how to use weapons, we don't like that, we need to put them back in their place. And so for that, as well as economic reasons, you had what was called the Red Summer of 1919, when there was red riots throughout the United States as the racial tensions built up following World War I and these returning veterans. Also, just a little side note, also that's when the federal government began doing surveillance of the Black communities, Black organizations, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. It would come after that time period of after the World War I. Now, the next important thing was going to be women's suffrage. Now, it's easy to say, yes, finally, women's suffrage, women get the right to vote. It was complicated. I didn't realize how complicated it was until I realized that during a women's march in Washington, you had to realize it's separate but equal. So many of the white women were segregationists. Some did not want Black women to participate in the women's suffrage march, and some didn't want them to be in the march at all. Some said that what's happening here? Others said that, there we go. Others said that, let me go back. Let me see if I can take that back. Something happened that threw me off. Let me go back. Just a little technical difficulty. Okay, here was the sticking point with women's suffrage. They told Ida B. Wells, who was at that particular demonstration, that she had to go to the back of the demonstration, the march. Now, here's why it was sticky. On one hand, since Reconstruction or redemption, the South was busy closing the veil as much as possible on the Black male vote. And now women's suffrage meant that now you're going to open a different veil in which Black women get to vote. So now you're increasing the Black vote. So that's what made it really complicated. You had race was the overwhelming factor. On one hand, they're trying to suppress the Black male vote, and now women's suffrage means that Black women now would be able to vote. So you're now expanding the vote. So you could see the complexity of the women's suffrage movement in terms of race in 1920. Next, others who thought that economics was very important. One would be A. Philip Randolph, very important person. He was selected as the leader with these, I always get the name wrong, the sleeping car. I'm not even going to say it because I'm going to get it wrong if I don't have my notes. But he thought that unions were the way to go in order to secure jobs. And he did something in 1941. It was very important because it was right before World War II broke out. He put pressure on President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. He threatened a march on Washington. Yes, before Martin Luther King 63 March on Washington, there was a March on Washington was being planned in 1941 in the summer. And the governor, I hit that too quickly. And sorry, I hit the button by mistake. Let's get back to that.
Not a worry. I actually have a question.
Controls are very, yes.
Well, about this 1920, the women's suffrage. So
yes,
women gained the right to vote, but not everybody could though, right? I mean, the Black women were still somehow excluded in places. Is that correct? Or do I have that wrong?
I don't have the answer for that. I don't have anything I can cite for that. Okay. But I just knew that was one of the sticking points of women's suffrage. I mean, obviously after World War I and women worked in white women worked in the factories, you know, they used that to say, hey, you know, we showed our loyalty and so forth. But the question of race was one of, you know, it's a juggling, and that's a part of separate but equal. It's this political juggling of trying to please one group and also pacify another. So, or maybe I said that wrong, but it's a juggling match, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was very important because early in the 20th century, they called it the Great Migration, when Blacks were moving, in like the 1910s and 20s, Blacks were moving from the South to the North. But this caused a larger migration of Blacks, particularly to the defense industries in California towards the West Coast. And it was, again, A. Philip Randolph, he pressured Franklin Roosevelt. He said, we're going to go and we're going to demonstrate before the world. We're going to march, we're going to demonstrate. Now, this is at the same time that, of course, Nazi Germany is in fascism with Nazi Germany and Mussolini and Japan. That's going on. So the United States doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of the world community. It's the place of democracy. And so President Roosevelt said to him, give me a minute. 4 days, he came back, he said, okay, we're going to come up with, I'm going to sign this executive order, 8802, and there should be no discrimination, race, creed, or color, or natural origin in hiring in the defense industry. Because while white women were able to get those jobs during World War I, blacks weren't. But once this was passed, it opened the doors. Now, enforcing it, that's a different story. But symbolically, the idea that a black leader was able to meet one-on-one with the president of the United States and get some results was symbolically a very important marker towards the American dream. So by the time you get to World War II, well, I shouldn't say by the time you get to World War II, that happened in the summer, and in December 7th of 1941, of course, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. And of course, the president's focus was going to be in a different direction. So that executive order happened at the right time. If they tried to do it during the war, it probably, one could argue, it probably would have been ignored. So African American men and women are fighting World War II. They're fighting under a campaign called the Double V, or the Double Victory: victory at home and victory abroad. They were disappointed that things didn't change after World War I. Now, the other thing that blacks were pushing towards in terms of civil rights was towards desegregating the military, because they thought getting to the American dream meant taking these little steps. And Charles Hamilton Houston, again, he was behind the scenes with the NAACP Defense Fund. And he's chopping down little by little. A. Philip Randolph wanted to end segregation in the military during World War I in 1941. But Franklin Roosevelt only gave him the executive order to prevent job discrimination. So once again, pressure on the federal government. This time with President Harry Truman, they pressured him and he also brought together a committee to recommend desegregation of the armed forces of the United States, regardless of race, color, religion, and national origin. Now, this was very important because the federal government was the largest employer of Black Americans at that time period. So once again, this was going to be an important point. Now, even for myself personally, in my personal career, my personal biography, not personal career, by the time of the Korean War, the United States military was desegregated. It was a difficult process, not an easy process. My father joined the United States Army in 1951 to fight in Korea. And then by the early 1960s, we were among one of the first Black families on a base in Busan, Korea, to live in military housing, because the president said that they were not only going to integrate the troops, but the schools on the federal bases, as well as the housing. So again, they're taking step by step towards this American dream to break down Plessy versus Ferguson. And then finally, Charles Hamilton Houston didn't get to see it, but his protege, Thurgood Marshall, had the whole case in good hand. Brown versus the Board of Education. Again, just like the Civil War, I don't have enough time to cover all of the implications of Brown versus the Board of Education, but the major point is this: it struck down Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal was no longer legal or constitutional in the United States. Now, enforcing it, that's another situation. There was massive resistance. Schools were closed, and private schools for white children would be open so they wouldn't have to be educated with Black children. Massive resistance. Governors, politicians refused federal court orders because the Supreme Court does not have the power to implement laws. So it would take a process before that would come about. So as I bring this into conclusion, and bring it back to now, I'm bringing it up to Martin Luther King's generation, because Supreme Court cases had their limits. And Thurgood Marshall knew it. You could pass court decision after decision. It was not changing people's lives on the street. The signs were not coming down. You had to work with the executive and legislative branch of the government. And so Martin Luther King comes on the scene. And again, I'm not going to go through much of his life because I could be here all day. But just to make a point, a connection between Jefferson, American Revolutionary generation, and Martin Luther King's Civil Rights generation. He starts his speech in Washington in 1963. This speech was important because Congress was debating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And President Lyndon Johnson, at first Robert Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson had to get political support. So they wanted to make sure this demonstration, this march on Washington was not going to ruin the ability to pass the 64 Civil Rights Act. Now, everybody knows it as the I Have a Dream speech, but it could have been named the We Can Never Be Satisfied as Long As. And so this is the main part of the speech he made that day. But everybody remembers the I Have a Dream part. And I shouldn't say everyone, but many people. So we're going to take a look at what was he saying during that speech when everyone embraced him. And, he's not everyone, I should take that back. But when he was being embraced, he said, "We shall never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We shall never be satisfied. Our bodies heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels and the highways and hotels of the cities. That's travel and public accommodations. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from one smaller ghetto to a larger one. That would imply fair housing. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs saying for whites only. And that speaks of the impact of segregation on Black children, the psychological aspect of segregation. He goes on to say, we can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing to vote for which to vote. And again, that's voting rights. We can never be satisfied as long as, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that one could imply or argue is his enforcement of civil rights acts and as well as justice. And he said, after that, then he says, I still have a dream. It's rooted deeply in the American dream. I have a dream today. And then he goes on, of course, with the dream that most people recite during Black History Month or Martin Luther King holiday. So he's got to, the speech and the March on Washington goes well. They're able to pass the 64 Civil Rights Act, which gradually brings down those signs. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had to be renewed every 20 years. And then the Fair Housing Act was signed by President Johnson after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So that was passed pretty much in his honor, if you will. At the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, just a reminder, he was not, there was a survey that said 70% of whites saw him as disfavorable and about 40 to 50% of Blacks saw him as disfavorable. He was not embraced as he was in the 1963 when he made the I Have a Dream speech. So he changes as you get to 1968, the year that he's assassinated. He makes a few statements, which I'm going to close with. And it comes from one of his last sermons in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta before he was assassinated. So this was the last sermon in his church. And he's speculating on race and something he's calling the drum major instinct. And as you can see, I'll just read it. I know you can read, I'll just read it for those who may not. Do you know that a lot of the race problem grows out of the drum major instinct? A need that some people have to feel superior, a need that some people have to feel that they are first and to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first. Again, you can reference back to Thomas Jefferson's American Revolutionary Generation. He said blacks are inferior. But he goes on further, and this is an important point he makes, which is he goes on to say that you are put in the position, speaking of white Americans, to support your oppressor, because through prejudice and blindness, you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in America society oppresses poor white people. And the only thing he has going for him is the false feeling that he is superior because his skin is white. And he cannot hardly eat and make his ends meet week in and week out. So he's making a very important statement. As a matter of fact, Coretta Scott King had part of this sermon played during Martin Luther King's funeral. And you can also find a quote from the drum major instinct on his monument in Washington, D.C. So in the end, the American Revolutionary Generation, those who were African Americans, free blacks and enslaved, who were here in the United States during the time of Jefferson, Washington, Henry, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, that was part of their legacy. That was part of their heritage. They fought side by side with white soldiers and integrated troops fighting for independence. But citizenship was going to be denied through various legislative acts through times. Reconstruction would bring about a day of jubilee, if you will, that the rights that their ancestors had fought for, their parents and grandparents, was finally achieved, unfortunately, through much death of another war. And then separate but equal, once again, kind of suffocate and regress that achievement until the civil rights generation were able to, through different means, they didn't always agree. They were not always friendly with each other. All of them had different paths to try to reach the same goal, to try to make the country one where people can live according to the American creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, at this point, I'm gonna, I think I went over by a minute or two, but I want to see if there are any questions or comments. And I just want to say I enjoyed sharing this presentation with NCU. And but my as a public historian, my favorite part is always answering people's questions. Because see, I could talk all day, but I want to know, what is it that people want to know? So hopefully there's some questions or comments.
We do have a few questions and a few comments. I did want to share someone's, one of their favorite MLK quotes: "Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance or conscientious stupidity." The current. Yes. And I just wanted to share that because we were talking about that and I thought it was worth repeating.
Yes.
So I'm gonna look into this some more myself too, because now I'm curious. So now I'm gonna have to do some research, which is fine. I like doing that. I do work in academia. But Sharif had mentioned when I had that question about the women's voting capabilities after the 19th Amendment. She mentioned in the Q&A in the South, Black men and women were blocked from voting, whereas they could vote in the North. So now you've sparked my interest, and now I have to go ahead and take a look at that further. But a question for you, Harvey. During the Jim Crow era, through the Great Migration of Blacks to northern cities, specifically Chicago, why was there such a political force of restricting Blacks from traveling out of the South while maintaining separate but equal ideas? If whites despised Blacks to the extent that they did and didn't want to share facilities, water fountain, schools, etc., why not just let Blacks leave the Southern and Southern whites could have possibly had their own white society? Why was that?
Oh, that one's simple. Labor. What they found out, when they saw large numbers of Blacks leaving the South, some at first, it seemed like at first they were saying like, good, they're leaving. And then they're like, oh, wait a minute, who's going to do this work? Sharecroppers and so on and so forth. Who's going to do this work if they leave and go to the North? So then they started making laws that made it difficult for people to leave the South. Some Blacks had already left to go to the West as well. But that's what basically it was. It was like, it's like separate but equal is like it creates a strange type of reality. I say some parts of American history, to me, in my opinion, is like a sci-fi movie. In the sense that's like science fiction. It's like, oh yeah, let's get the Black people out of here, out the South. We don't want Black rule. Oh, too many of them are leaving. Who's going to do the work? And matter of fact, that also happened when it came to earlier back in after the American Revolution, when there were many Northerners talking about the answer to slavery is to emancipate the slaves and deport them. Well, others were saying, well, wait a minute, if you deport all the free Blacks and all the Negroes out of the United States, who's going to do all the work? And so, so you had, again, dissension on that part. So there are theories that people have, and then there's practicality. When it starts hitting people in the pocketbooks economically, then it's like, oh, we need to do something. And then they use their political mechanisms to make contracts and so forth, to arrest people and so forth, to prevent the movement as much as possible. I don't know how effective it was, but that's your answer.
All right, thank you very much for that. And thanks for asking that question, Derek. Appreciate that. There's another comment in here that I want to share, and then just please feel free to post any other last minute questions. But Dr. Kimmel mentioned she had to leave for another meeting, but she wanted to thank you for carving out the time to communicate and educate us. I really appreciate your concept that history is more than just information and numbers, rather it is people that lived their lives. And
yes.
And that is something that I have taken away from this tiered webinar session. I just think it's really important. I mean, you do share historical data with us, but I think sometimes when people think about the span of a life, they don't realize actually how short that is in the period of history.
Yeah.
So these things, we are not that far removed from these things happening in our country. And obviously we clearly have more struggles to overcome. So we appreciate you very much for
You're welcome.
coming.
You're welcome.
Take care, everybody.